Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. The fact that you are here right now is a statement about your care for our town's teen and children. My name is Buck Allen. I'm a recent college graduate and the Community Fund of Darien's Thriving Youth Associate. I myself am a DHS graduate from the class of 2017, and I've gotten to see firsthand the ins and outs of that Darien High School experience, from the varsity sports to the school dress days, to the theater plays, the bumper stickers you put on your car, and even the sparsely attended homecomings. I can speak to the pressures of being a teen in Darien. Darien has prepared me for college. However, when I got to college, I was surprised by how much less stressed I was than I was in high school. As you'll soon see, the data we've collected covers a variety of topics, from mental health to substance use to familial relationships. However, the common source and seed of all these findings is how can we help our teens to be the happiest and healthiest versions of themselves, not just the most successful. Part of my role at the Community Fund is to facilitate focus groups for students, to ask for their perspective on what Darien is like. When asked what parents and adults should know about the teen experience in Darien, two answers have commonly come up. The first is that being a high school student in Darien is a full-time job, and it's hard to find space. Students have to wake up at around 6:30 a.m. for school, commute to school by 7:40 a.m. with 6 hours of class with 4 different classes, plus PE, ending school at 2:20 p.m. There's typically 3 hours of sports practice, 6 days a week where you must win. After commuting home, they prepare for 6 classes where some must get good grades. Then there's dinner and hopefully a bedtime of around 10 or 10:30, hoping for 8 hours of sleep, and then repeating that 5 days a week. The second thing teens often bring up in focus groups is that this isn't the high school experience you think it is. There's a nationwide and even global hyperfixation on American high school culture, but it's not as exciting as what we see on the screen. There's little time for relationships or dating. There's less focus in Darien on creativity or focus on the arts. And there's also a few campus-wide and town-wide bonding events. We want to understand what teens are going through, but sometimes there's a disconnect between what their experience is, the questions we're asking. The goal of this presentation is to help bridge that gap between parents' understanding of how to help their teens thrive. With that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Georgette Harrison. Georgette is the Director of Clinical and Community Partnerships of the Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut, an affiliate of Community Health Centers. Ms. Harrison is also co-chair for the Thriving Youth Task Force. She earned her Master's of Education in Counseling and Psychology from Teachers College at Columbia University. She's a licensed professional counselor in the state of Connecticut, a rostered child parent psychotherapy clinician, and the agency trainer for the Attachment Regulation Competency Treatment Model, both of which are treatments for children who have been exposed to potentially traumatic events. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Georgette. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight as the Thriving Youth Task Force shares the results of the 2021 Darien Student Survey. I would also like to introduce my co-presenter, Dr. Mitch Dickey. Dr. Dickey has a PhD in psychology from Yale University. He is a licensed psychologist and is nationally recognized for his research on emotional intelligence. He is also the parent of a teenager. So tonight we'll give you a brief overview of the Thriving Youth Task Force and share with you the history of the student survey, including the framework as well as the methodology that we use to draw conclusions. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about what was unique about this year's survey, as well as how COVID-19 might have impacted our survey results. Then we'll dive right in and start to take a look at some of the trends and patterns that we saw in student mental health as well as student substance use. At the end, we're going to review next steps, and you'll hear from a group of panelists who will expand on those trends and patterns and also give you some tools that you can use to support the young people in your home and in your community. So first off, let me tell you a little bit about the Thriving Youth Task Force. TYTF is a volunteer coalition that convenes local organizations to promote and empower positive youth development with the end goal of reducing substance use. It was founded in 2008 and currently includes leaders from 35 different organizations that serve youth in Darien. We're lucky to have a wide range of expertise and experience sitting at the table, anywhere from the Darien Public Schools, the Darien Police Department, healthcare and mental health professionals, elected town officials, youth service organizations, and clergy. This is now our 7th year of grant funding focused on substance use prevention. And the CDC recently awarded the Thriving Youth Task Force with a 5-year grant for the drugs-free communities in order to continue our prevention work. And the Community Fund of Darien serves as a convener for TYTF, as well as the fiduciary for grants that are awarded to support our efforts in substance use prevention. Before we get going with the trends and the patterns, we did want to say a big thank you to the Darien Public Schools, as well as the Middlesex Middle School and Darien High School students and parents. Without them, we would not be here tonight. We wouldn't have been able to share any of this relevant data with you. We also want to say a thank you to our survey committee, including our co-chairs, Shelley Scotland and Shelley Sheridan. And they poured over the data for hours and hours with Dr. Dickey. So thank you again for all the hard work that went into bringing this tonight. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of the survey. It was first completed in 2008, and it's been completed every 3 years since. And this is now our 5th iteration. It was done in partnership with Darien Public Schools, and all the survey responses were completely anonymous. And the parents had the option of being able to review the questions before they allowed their teen to take it, as well as they had the option to opt out altogether. And for those who are familiar with their work, you know that similar surveys have been done nationally as well as within our county. So Westport, Greenwich, Fairfield, Stamford, and Norwalk have all conducted similar assessments. This year, our respondents fell pretty evenly amongst genders. So we had 993 of respondents that identified as female, 973 respondents self-identified as male, and 59 students that had either selected other or stated that they preferred not to respond. And as we move forward in the presentation, whenever I refer to male students or female students, I am referring to the students that self-identified as male or female. So we'll leave you now with Dr. Dickey to review what's different about this year's survey compared to prior iterations, as well as to discuss some of our methodology.
This year's survey was different in a few respects. The first one was that in prior years, they had 2 separate surveys. One was about youth substance use, and one was about the things that were going on in their lives. But because those 2 surveys were separate, you couldn't really link what was going on in their lives to their substance use. So this year, we combined the 2 surveys. The second thing that we did was we added sections on social and emotional health, on families, a little bit more about peers, on the stresses, and on COVID, because COVID is everywhere. So with those 2 changes, that allowed us to do some different things with the data analyses. It allowed us to, the first thing we did was to form groups or clusters of kids. And then the other parts of the survey said, well, what's driving those behaviors or those concerns? So the clusters, we clustered in the area of substance use, and we clustered in the area of mental health. And the clusters were things like don't use alcohol or any drugs at all, alcohol only, moderate levels of several substances, or heavy multi-use. So those categories allowed us to really pinpoint some of the analysis. And after that, we used some artificial intelligence tools, some machine learning tools to then try to predict who would go into what clusters. And that really allowed us to get a much more fine-grained understanding of what was driving what for whom. And with that, I will turn it back over to Georgette for the next slide.
So we would be remiss to not acknowledge that this survey was taken in the middle of a pandemic. And the impact of it, we were still trying to understand. First of all, we should consider this survey as really a snapshot of unprecedented times. We can't underestimate how quarantine, stay-at-home orders, close proximity to family members, and social distancing can impact substance use and the access to substances. We also can't forget about what healthcare professionals are calling the hidden pandemic. So the rising rates of mental health concerns that are driving families to seek mental health treatment for their young people, whether it be with a mental health provider or in the time of crisis at an emergency room department. As Mitch mentioned in the prior slides, we're going to review those two primary areas of interest, substance use and mental health. And we're going to focus a little less on percentages, even though that's also very important because we want to know how many kids are doing what. But we're really wanting to take a look at what seems to be driving the behavior that we're concerned about. This can help us together as a community really think about how do we support these kids with more actionable and insightful interventions. So when asked about how COVID has impacted their lives, we should know that substance use has decreased every single time that we've done the survey. Across the board, e-cigarettes, alcohol, and marijuana has decreased every time that we have conducted the survey. But we should be mindful, again, of how access to substances and close proximity to family members might have impacted the rates for this year. We also asked about the use of other substances, but the numbers were so small that they're not reported here. When asked about the impact of COVID on their day-to-day lives, teens were reporting that they were spending more time interacting on social media and consuming content online compared to pre-pandemic times, which again, for anyone who has a teenager at home, that doesn't really come as a surprise. They also reported that they were spending less time playing sports and seeing friends in person, which again, this was taken in February. And so most people were still staying at home for the vast majority of the time. The vast majority of students said that they were feeling more anxiety, more sadness, and more loneliness and isolation, despite their best efforts to try to stay connected. And this is not unique to Darien, though. The CS Mott Children's Hospital National Poll on Children's Health reported that 46% of parents shared that their teenager was showing signs of either a new onset or a worsening of mental health disorders. And that parents of young women were much more likely to report symptoms of anxiety and depression when compared to parents of young women. So as we go through the presentation, we're also going to share with you some commonly held myths about substance use in teens. And we'll compare it to either our data or national data to share with you what the data actually shows. The first myth is that all kids are drinking in high school. It's just part of the normative teen experience. The fact is, the data doesn't support that. Up until high school, most of our kids are not drinking or using substances. As we go through this data in greater detail, we'll share with you what seems to be sort of these critical points where the rates start to go up. But I can share with you that a lot of that is grade and age. So let's take a look at some of the actual numbers. As I had mentioned, only a very small fraction of students in middle school reported having used alcohol in the last 30 days. And we see a rapid uptick between 9th and 10th grades, implying that something is changing in terms of a teen's perception of the acceptability of alcohol use, maybe exposure to other people drinking, or access to alcohol. This might be one of those critical periods that we might consider where we can double down on our efforts to help kids hold off on using either alcohol or drugs. However, it is really in the 12th grade where we see almost 50% of students reporting that they used alcohol in the last 30 days. So let's spend a little bit more time really digging into the data and trying to see what seems to be happening. First of all, let's take a look at some of the patterns of use and behavior. Now, these categories were created based on student responses to several substance use questions on the survey. These categories were not based just on a single response to one item. These were several items that were compiled to really take a look at trends and patterns of behavior. The first category is no use. So students were reporting that they are substance free. The second category is alcohol only. Students were drinking, but not too frequently or heavily, and they're reporting that they're not using any other substances. The third category is moderate use. Students were drinking frequently, and they're using other substances, mainly marijuana. And heavy use is our fourth category. Students were drinking heavily, frequently, and they're using other substances. Again, mostly marijuana. So when we take a look at the percentages of teens who fall into these categories by grade, we continue to see that 7th and 8th graders fall in the no use category. The vast majority are reporting that they're not using. Then once we get to 9th and 10th grade, we start to see a small subset of kids that are starting to report that they're using alcohol, not too heavily, not too frequently. But we also start to see that 7% of 9th and 10th graders are reporting that they're using frequently and using other substances, mostly marijuana. By the 11th and 12th grades, the number of teens reporting no use drops to 53% from 91%. While having slightly over half of 11th and 12th graders not using is certainly something to build upon and to celebrate, we're also concerned about the 33% of teens who are reporting moderate use. So again, they're drinking frequently and using other substances. And the 4% of teens who are reporting heavy use. They're drinking frequently, heavily, and they're using other substances. Now, these are certainly sobering statistics. So what are some of the general trends and patterns that we're noticing with these numbers? Alcohol continues to be the single most used substance in town. Grade is a single most significant predictor for use. Now, one interesting finding that we had is that sadness, anxiety, and loneliness did not predict use, which was sort of mind-boggling for a lot of us. Part of it is that if two data sets are linked, usually, like let's say mental health concerns and substance use, but in times of COVID, mental health issues rise, but substance use decreases, these data points become unlinked. It also means that we have a lot of kids who are reporting high levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness who are not drinking and who are coping in other ways. And then there's another group of kids that are drinking, not because they're feeling badly about themselves or feeling sadness, anxiety, and loneliness, but because they're reporting that they do this in order to have fun. However, when you remove grade from the equation and you add bullying, exposure to bullying, so being bullied, being in person, online, having a friend who has been bullied, you actually start to see that there is a correlation between those mental health concerns and bullying and substance use. It's just that grade was such a strong predictor of substance use that it was masking the effect of these mental health concerns on youth. As we saw in the earlier slides, we have a large segment of 11th and 12th graders who are reporting either moderate or heavy use. These are teens who are drinking frequently, heavily, and the consequences that they're reporting actually start to give us a little bit of a picture of what the party culture might be like in town. Most report that they're drinking in parties with no adults present. They're drinking competitive games, drinking games. They're blacking out, and they're experiencing hangovers the following day. They're also leaving town in order to get alcohol. And while they're predominantly using alcohol, they're also using other substances. Again, marijuana being the primary one, but a small instance of prescription drugs that were not prescribed to them, as well as other drugs of abuse. The second myth is that there is nothing that we can do about it. That it's part of the culture, and that even as parents, if we were to say anything, their teens are just going to do what teens are going to do. However, the data actually shows something very different. Parents can actually greatly reduce the likelihood that their teens will use substances. But let's take a look at the survey data that actually supports this notion. So we didn't want to just take a look at what were some of the factors that were driving substance use. We also wanted to take a look at what were the factors associated with students that were reporting that they weren't using any substances. On an individual level, those teens were reporting that they were choosing to drink and not use substances because they just didn't want to, or they perceived their parents to be strict. These were the top two reasons to not drink or use drugs. They were eager to do well in school. Whenever they, can you guys hear me? No. Okay, so hopefully people at home can hear me. I will try to project a little bit more until we figure out what's going on with the microphone. So when these teenagers were experiencing some sort of setback or challenge, they felt well equipped to be able to handle that frustration, that disappointment. They also reported that their peers were more likely to be able to, more likely to report that they wouldn't approve of marijuana use or alcohol use. They were also more likely to report that there was a positive adult role model in their life. They reported feeling safe, secure in their home, and they were willing to talk to their parents about alcohol, sex, and drugs. So it seems like having that open line of communication with your teens in your home is incredibly protective and one of the single most predictive factors in your teen deciding not to use substances. There's also some additional parent and family variables that we wanted to share with you that were associated with teens deciding not to use. For older teens, they reported that their parents made an effort to know where they were during nights and weekends. And for the younger students, they reported that their parents made an effort to know where they were during the day. Parents within the household were on the same page about substance use. They had the same message. And they had very clear rules about alcohol use within the home. They strongly disagreed with underage drinking and substance use. Now, this is particularly relevant because we also saw from the survey that student perception of parental disapproval of substance use actually declined drastically in high school. Now, we can't say for sure whether parents actually stopped disapproving of alcohol use or drug use during that age, but students certainly perceived it to be so. Now, we can hypothesize that even the most vigilant of parents who have had multiple conversations with their teens about not using and that they don't approve of underage drinking might assume that by the time that they get to high school, they already know, your kids already know how you feel about it. The thing is, we know that it's important to continue to have these conversations. We can't assume that our kids know how we feel about it as they get older. So silence is not necessarily conducive to them assuming that your opinion on the topic hasn't changed. Parental vigilance continues to be an incredibly powerful influence on a student's decision to not use substances. The last myth that we want to debunk today is that drinking in high school is no big deal, and that it's actually protective to teach our kids to drink before they go to college. There is absolutely no data anywhere to support this, whether nationally or within our data set. What we actually know is that 9 out of 10 adults with a substance use disorder reported that they started drinking before they were 18. We also know that for every year that a student chooses to delay alcohol use or drug use, they experience less and less alcohol-related problems later on in life. We also know that alcohol changes your teen's brain at a time when it is developing and changing rapidly. And not to mention the legal implications of underage drinking. In fact, in a national study, Dr. Tracy found that 20% of students or college students were involved in 50% of the disruptions on campus. So things like ER visits, blackouts, anything that you can think of in terms of an alcohol-related issue on campus, that was 20% of students were involved in 50% of those disruptions. So why does that matter to us as parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers? Because it's those teens who reported that their parents allowed them to drink were 4 times more likely to be a part of that 20%. And so it's safe to say that that 20% in college, they're not going to have a successful college experience. So we hope that parents walk away with some key takeaways from the survey data. You have an incredibly important part to play in your teen's substance use prevention. Your teen is less likely to use if they perceive that you are vigilant about where they are and what they're doing. And if you can convey explicit, clear expectations and rules about substance use, that you want them to delay use as long as possible, and that you don't approve of underage drinking. And by keeping these lines of communication open with your family and having repeated conversations with your teens about it, you can make a decision in your child's, you can make a difference in your child's decision to not use. We are particularly encouraged by these findings because it supports what we know, that there's a way to both be able to have an open, honest, trusting relationship with your teen. One where, as parents, we're not shying away from the difficult conversations, and also give them a clear message about how to stay safe. Despite a teen's appropriate search for independence at this age, they're still seeking our guidance around the big issues. And we can serve as one of the most important prevention strategies in the community by continuing to act as their guide, as their North Star at a time of great emotional change and upheaval. So let's move on to talk about student mental health. But before we get into the data, I want to ask you to do something together with me. I want you to think about the teens in your household. How are they doing? How have they dealt with COVID and the challenges that are related to COVID? Now think about their friends. How are they doing? And then think about how you're doing, because COVID didn't just happen to our kids. And I want you to think back to the last time that someone sat down with you, no rush, no agenda, and asked you how you were doing. Not a, hey, how are you? But a, hey, how are you doing? How are you dealing with all of this? What was that moment like for you? And I want you to hold on to that feeling as we move through the next section. Similarly to the substance use categories, we have 5 categories of kids that are divided up depending on their mental health presentation. Now, again, this is not based on just a single response. This is based on their responses to multiple mental health questions. Now, we should know that these are not meant to be diagnostic criteria, but we should be concerned about the subset of kids that are reporting really high levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness. So the first category is the thriving category. Students that feel good about themselves, they experience low levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness. That's 31% of our kids. Then we have the okay category. Kids who are feeling okay about themselves, and they're experiencing some levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness. Probably normative. Again, we're in the middle of a pandemic. The third subset are kids who are anxious. They feel okay about themselves, but they're reporting high levels of anxiety, but low levels of sadness and loneliness. And then we have 20% of our students who are in the vulnerable category. Students who are not feeling good about themselves and are experiencing high levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness. And then 20% of our students are in the distressed category. They feel bad about themselves, and they're experiencing the highest levels of anxiety, sadness, and loneliness. That is 46% of our respondents, of our students, who are reporting that they're feeling high levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness. Now, if you recall, 46% was actually what the CS Hospital survey showed as well, that 46% of parents were reporting that their child was experiencing a new onset or a worsening of a mental health disorder. We're seeing that the students are reporting the same thing. It's not just the parents. Now, for those at home and here who are wondering, where does my child fall in this category? Just know that the panelists will talk to you more about how to start this conversation, how to really have a good conversation about how kids are doing. Now, as we looked at the gender composition in each category, we found some gender differences. Before we move on to the gender differences, I want to acknowledge that there was a subset of students who selected other or preferred not to answer. We're not including their data here, not because they're not important, but because the numbers were such that we couldn't draw significant conclusions responsibly about how they were doing. However, we know from national data that students who are transgender, non-binary, or gender expansive are much more likely to report mental health concerns and exposure to bullying. So we need to be mindful as a community. We have the responsibility that as we select interventions together, we have to make sure that those interventions are both inclusive and respectful of every student in our student body. Now, as you can see from this chart, students who self-identified as male were much more likely to be in the thriving or the okay category when compared to their female counterparts. And female students were much more likely to fall in the vulnerable or distressed categories. These gender differences actually became even more pronounced in the 11th and 12th grades. And because of this finding, we wanted to dig deeper and find out what might be going on. So female students, when compared to their male counterparts, were much more likely to report higher levels of sadness, anxiety, and loneliness. And this was across all grades, but particularly 10th and 11th and 12th grades. They were also more likely to report social stress, particularly around social media. So this is not surprising, particularly in light of the testimony given by Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen at the beginning of October, where she describes an algorithm that takes a teen from searching for healthy recipes on Facebook to anorexia promoting content in record time. However, the detrimental effects of social media on mental health is not news. It's nothing new. We have a lot of research out there that shows that social media is linked to increased feelings of depression, anxiety, poor body image, and loneliness in teens. However, we also saw some protective factors amongst our female students. The students that were reporting good mental health reported that they felt valued by those around them. They felt in control of their life. They also reported a supportive family system. They perceived that their parents approved of them. They felt in control of their life, and they had a certain level of comfort being able to talk to their parents about serious issues. They also felt included in family decision-making. Now, this is actually perfectly in line with research on resilience, that when girls and young women are encouraged by those around them to be proactive and assertive in their life and supported in their search for independence, and they're active decision makers in their community and in their households, they're much more likely to be resilient in the face of adversity. Now, students who self-identified as male were much more likely to report lower levels of felt sadness, anxiety, and depression, and loneliness, I apologize, across all grades compared to female counterparts. However, they were much more likely to report academic stress. We also found some protective factors amongst our male students who were reporting good mental health. They reported that they had a supportive social environment. They were more likely to report that they had mentors, coaches, teachers, and neighbors that they felt cared about them. They also described a family environment with an open line of communication with them. So again, this falls perfectly in line with the research on resilience, that when young men are encouraged to be emotionally expressive and they have that kind of communication with their families, they do better. They also thrive when they have a positive role model, particularly when it's a male source of identification. We can also share that the research on resilience shows that young men thrive with greater structure and parental supervision. So what are some protective factors for good mental health that cut across all genders? Again, feeling valued, feeling in control of your life came up again, which makes sense, right? To feel like someone truly values you, thinks that you are amazing, and that you actually have control over what happens to you leads to good mental health. Developing a sense of purpose in life, a reason to get up every morning, was also associated with good mental health. They were also developing good health habits, and they were avoiding things that they perceived to be either dangerous or unhealthy. There were also some community level variables. So they were more likely to report that they were engaged in their learning, and they were engaged in clubs and groups, both inside school as well as outside. So having that positive sense of their place in their school and in their community, being an active learner, and feeling safe and having fun in school and in their community is really important in order for a teen to thrive. And some of the family variables associated with good mental health are, they reported that they were spending quality time with their parents, and that time and the messages that they received from their parents actually made them feel good about themselves. They perceived the advice that they got from their parents as helpful, and they were receiving strong messages from their parents about pro-social behavior, things like not lying, things like not gossiping, things like having good academic integrity were much more likely to be associated with good mental health. And while they felt like they had strong, clear messages about how their parents wanted them to behave, they actually said that meeting their parents' expectations was not a source of stress for them. We can hypothesize that this is because the expectations felt like they were realistic, or that the parents were actually supporting them in meeting these expectations as opposed to just setting them. So while it's incredibly important for us to take a look at the protective factors, we also really want to know what is causing our teens stress. Now, this is the first time that we asked this question, so we can't compare it to prior years, and we can't completely know how COVID might have impacted these sources of stress. Now, we're going to focus on the red sections in this particular graph because these are the kids that are reporting that this particular stressor is causing them a lot of stress. Now, that's not to say that we don't want our kids to feel some stress. Stress, a little bit of stress, even a moderate amount of stress is a good thing. This is what motivates us to learn, to get better, to want to do better. However, when that level of stress rises to the degree that it's paralyzing, when it actually starts to make you feel bad about yourself, it's actually not conducive to having our teens meet their goals. So getting a good grade is the single most important source of stress for teens in Darien. And as they get older, it takes up much more and more mental real estate. So it's not surprising that 74% of 11th graders are saying that getting good grades is causing them a lot of stress, particularly when this is the time when they're applying to colleges. It might also account for the fact that that red section, that percentage of kids drops in 12th grade. And speaking of colleges, the second most important source of stress for teens in Darien is getting into a good college. So not surprising for an achievement-oriented teen. But what is surprising is that practically 30% of 7th graders are reporting that getting into a good college is causing them a lot of stress. Now, we want to support our teens in succeeding academically and getting them on a good college trajectory. But we also want to be mindful about what might be causing this degree of stress in 30% of 7th graders. The third source of stress is standardized testing, particularly for 10th and 11th graders, likely related to when they have to worry about college entrance exams in earnest. And this is also likely the reason for the drop in the 12th grade. Now, there were other sources of stress that were significant, but not as high as these three. One was meeting parental expectations. Again, we know that students who are reporting good mental health actually report that they don't feel stressed by meeting their parents' expectations. So we want to make sure that whatever those expectations are developmentally appropriate and that we support our kids in meeting those expectations. This was across all grades. Now, excelling in sports was the other source of stress for them, particularly for ninth graders, likely because this is when they're trying out for teens. And then COVID and pandemic related losses. This was particularly true for our 12th graders. Now, this might be due to the perceived loss of these major milestones that are associated with graduation. So even though the school has made tremendous efforts in trying to make sure that these milestones are celebrated, they might not be celebrated in the same way that teens were fantasizing about. Now, we also have to remember that this was taken in February, when COVID vaccines were just being distributed, and they were not allowed for this population just yet. And so we didn't truly know how vaccination rates might impact our quote unquote return to normal. So in February, at that point in time, seniors might have been wondering about, do I go to college? Am I gonna have to, go to college but stay here? If I do go, am I gonna have a good dorm experience? And also, what does it mean to leave my family at a time of such uncertainty? Now, the good news is that some of the sort of factors that we associate with sort of normative teen experience, right, or like stressors or for teenagers, like having a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or peer pressure, being popular. These were actually the lowest sources of stress for teens. Looking attractive and having as much money as peers. These were all sources of stress that students were reporting were really not causing them a lot of stress. So what are some of the key takeaways about teen mental health? As a community, we can work together to support teens in feeling valued, that they're in control of their lives in a developmentally appropriate way, and to make sure that they have a sense of purpose. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that a person can survive anyhow as long as they have a why. And that is just as true today as it was when he wrote it, and just as true for our teens as they are for us as grown-ups. We need to be mindful of academic performance and how that is the single most important source of stress for our teens. To make sure that we are identifying when that level of stress becomes paralyzing, to be able to support those teens in that moment. And to keep an open line of communication with your teens, because that's the single most associated predictor of good mental health. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this segment, when I asked you to think back to that time when someone sat down with you and asked you how you were doing, with no agenda, no rush, nothing, just interest. That is the feeling that as a community, we want to convey to our teens. That we care, that we want to listen, that we're curious, and that we're here for them. Now, in the past, based on survey responses, the Thriving Youth Task Force has organized programming that address some of the survey findings. We had our Darien 06820 campaign designed to provide information about the impact of alcohol use on the developing brain and to encourage healthier habits. We have also organized several book groups and talks for parents and students to explore topics around substance use and mental health. So for example, we had a reading of Beautiful Boy together, and we had a conversation with Dr. Bartolomeo from Silver Hill Hospital. We also learned about teen mental health, substance use, and how to improve communication with their teens with Christina Young. And in collaboration with other community partners, we also learned about substance use from Chris Heron. But that was our prior programming. We have new information. So what are some of these opportunities for growth that we can collaborate on as a community? We can support parents in having open, trusting conversations with their children. Because while these conversations are important, no one ever gave us a manual on how to have that conversation. And as a community, we can support parents in being vigilant about their kids' activities in a way that's developmentally appropriate, in a way that's not overwhelming. Because instead, what we want to do is send that message that we're still interested in what they're doing. We also need to be mindful of those primary sources of stress that we had talked about. As a community, we can also partner to find ways to show students that they're valued for who they are, and identifying those teens that need more intensive support. Part of this is building your teen's team. That means every parent, every teacher, every counselor, mentor, coach, neighbor, every person that comes in contact with that teen can come together to help them feel valued in their community. Now, we're aware that tonight was the start of this conversation, and we're mindful that the best way to support our teens is to do so as a community. So we're always looking for feedback. So please, if you want to let us know what you're interested in learning more about, please don't be shy. Reach out to us, because we really want to hear from every single one of you. And before I introduce the panelists, please save the date for our next book group on November 8th at 7 p.m., which we're organizing in response to the survey findings for this year. We will talk about Michael Thompson's The Pressured Child and how to best support your teen. The TYTF Programming Committee is working closely with community partners to make sure that we are responsive in the face of this data. There's still a lot to be done, and tonight was the first of many ways in which TYTF can convene community partners to rally the tremendous amount of local expertise to help support teens and their parents. So to learn more about our survey findings, you can go on our website. For those who are here in the audience, you can take out your phones and use your QR reader. But let me introduce you to our first panelist. Tracy Masela is a licensed clinical social worker who graduated from Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service, earning the Dr. Edward L. Curran Award for highest achievement in academics, practical experience, and school service. During her time at Fordham, Ms. Masela worked at the New Haven Family Alliance, developing an adolescent court diversion program, working with adolescents and families in the community through mediation, family therapy, and case management. Ms. Masela was part of the multidisciplinary clinical team at Silver Hill Hospital in New Canaan for 10 years, and she is currently working as a community outreach consultant for the hospital. While at Silver Hill, Tracy worked with adults and adolescents with a full range of diagnoses, including substance use disorders, personality disorders, and mood disorders, and was the program manager for the Adolescent Transitional Living Program. And she has a private practice in Wilton. Rebecca Campbell is a licensed clinical social worker. She graduated from New York University with a master's in social work in 2006. And as part of her internship, she worked at the Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut, as well as Project Return Group Home for Adolescent Girls in Westport. It was during these placements that she realized her passion for treating children and their families and pursued additional training in the William Allenson White Institute Child and Adolescent Training Program. She has extensive experience working in both private practice and served as a school social worker in Wilton High School and the Fairfield Public School System. She is currently the Director of Therapy Services at Sasko River Center. And last but not least, Dr. Scott McCarthy, who received his PhD in educational psychology with a concentration in school psychology from the University of Connecticut, and is a Maternal and Child Health Bureau's Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities Fellow. He currently serves as a program director of special education and student services, as well as a district school climate coordinator for Darien Public Schools, and is a lecturer at Fordham University's Graduate School in the Division of Psychological and Educational Studies. He was named the 2016 Outstanding Early Career Professional by the University of Connecticut's Neig School of Education Alumni Society, as well as the 2014 Exemplary Early Career School Psychologist by the National Association of School Psychology. Dr. Mccarthy serves on the Junior Board of Advisors for the Family and Children's Agency of Fairfield County. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome. So, Tracy.
Okay, so should I use the mic? Can you guys hear me without the mic?
Yeah.
Yeah?
The people at home might not be able to hear you,
Okay,
so you'll need to
right.
pass the mic.
pass the mic. Okay, I'm gonna turn it on. Is that on? It's better without the mic. Excellent. Yes. All right. First of all, I just want to give huge kudos to Georgette and Mitch and the Thriving Youth Task Force for such an amazing presentation of incredible data. Personally, I think that this type of study, whole research should be done in all of our schools so that we can plan our programming to what the kids really need. So thank you very much. I just wanted to start with a very brief discussion of our brains, very, very brief. Two areas come into play when we talk about adolescence. The first is the limbic system, which is our caveman brain, very, very deep in our brain. And the limbic system, you might also hear the amygdala, is fully developed by the time kids are very little, right? Fully functioning, doing exactly what it's supposed to do by the time you're 2 years old, okay? So you have by the time you're a teen, you've been working with, living with, operating with your limbic system for years, and you know it works, right? And what does the limbic system do? That's where our emotions sit, right? So the amygdala is constantly on the lookout for anything that is dangerous or life-threatening and anything that might be fun, right? Constantly surveying both internal and external environment to see what is going on, okay? We may not always be aware of the signals that our amygdala is giving us. Sometimes we are. The other part of our brain that comes into play for this discussion particularly is the prefrontal cortex, which is up here. This is the last part of our brain to be fully developed. And as you said, during adolescence, there's a lot of work being done on the prefrontal cortex, right? So that's where our reason, planning, logic, organization, all those executive function skills sit in the prefrontal cortex, right? So when adolescents are faced with a situation, particularly emotional situation, they heavily rely on their very mature limbic system, all right? So that's the emotional center. So if it seems fun, they're gonna chase it, right? And it's not that adolescents think that they are invincible. They don't, but they knowingly take risks because of their emotions, relying heavily on their emotions and that search for fun and pleasure, and also the influence of peers. When kids are moving into adolescence and young adulthood, they move away from parents as kind of the arbiter of what is good and right and what you should do to their peers. So the peers become very influential in terms of that question that all adolescents must answer, and that's, who am I? So they're looking at the mirror of their peers as opposed to their parents for the first time in their life. This is often hard for parents to hear and accept, but that is what is happening. So you've got kids, adolescents that are relying on this limbic system, which is seeking fun and pleasure, right? And so they're knowingly taking their risks. And it's not that they don't have intellectual capacity. They do. They have capacity far beyond certainly what I was capable of at their age. When you look at the curriculum that most of these kids are shouldering, this has nothing to do with intellectual ability. This just has to do with the adolescent brain and the heavy reliance on emotions as opposed to reason. Okay. So two points that I wanted to make about the substance use data that was found. And the one that always strikes me is this myth that we can teach our kids how to drink. And there have been numerous studies that just debunk this myth. In fact, it's actually the opposite. If you binge drink in high school, you are more likely to binge drink in college. If you don't binge drink in high school, you probably won't binge drink in college. So teaching our kids to drink is teaching them how to become binge drinkers, how to drink without moderation, how to drink to blackout, and how to become that 40% of the kids or 20% of the kids that are causing 50% of the problems, right? So that's the first thing that stands out. And I was talking to one of my college age students, clients today, and she was telling, I was asking about substance use. She grew up in one of Fairfield County towns. And she said, yeah, it's, we basically drink every night. Monday night, it might just be hanging around the rooms. And that's not really drinking because we're only using seltzer, right? Hard seltzer. So it's not really drinking because, you have to do work. And Tuesday, sometimes we go out, but not really. But Wednesdays, Wednesdays is wine Wednesdays. So you have to drink. And then Thursdays is Thirsty Thursdays. So you got to go. And then Friday and Saturday, don't even be ridiculous, right? It's Friday and Saturday. And then Sunday, there's football and day drinking. And so, yeah, basically every day. And this is not a kid that has a substance use disorder. He would not qualify for that. This is normative college behavior, right? And this starts in high school. This mentality that I got to drink. Fun centers around drinking, right? And they carry that with them into the college years. So this idea that there's nothing we can do about this, that kids are kids and we can't really stop what's already happening, that is really worrisome. The perception that these kids have that after a while, the parents really don't care if they're drinking, right? That's what we heard from the data. There's this perception that over time, yeah, they may talk about it when you're in middle school, but heck, nobody's drinking in middle school. By the time they get to the age where it is ubiquitous to go out and drink, parents aren't talking about it anymore. So what do kids think? Well, they just don't care. That is so dangerous, right? Because remember, as I said, they're not looking to parents to reflect back who they are and how they're doing. They're looking to their peers. So if there's nothing coming from the parent direction in terms of feedback, all they have is their peers. That is really scary, really scary. So parenting doesn't stop when your kid is old enough to drive or when your kid is heading off to college, right? Parenting continues throughout your life. You play that one role in your kid's life, and you're the only one that can play that role. It's a hugely important role. And let me tell you, kids want you to play that role. Listen, it's our job to create a frame, a family frame. It's the kids' job to push against the frame. And if they find chinks in that frame, they're going to go through it. That's what kids do. We shouldn't be surprised that they experiment with drugs and alcohol. We have to be ready to deal with it. And we do that by creating this frame, which is basically our mission statement as a family. It's the rules, regulations, policies, and procedures that every good organization has. And you want to make sure that you build the frame when they're young, 7th grade, when they're not drinking, because that needs to be enforced consistently and effectively throughout high school. You don't want to be making rules when the kid comes home drunk. You want those rules, I mean, you want to laminate it, put it on your refrigerator, you want to talk about it regularly. You just want to be able to point when they come home, all right? Rules are based on safety. It is illegal and unsafe for teenagers to drink, full stop. This is not negotiable, okay? It's illegal for a reason. Things are illegal because if you don't abide by that rule, you have an increased likelihood of having an adverse effect, okay? That's what a rule is. We put that rule in place because it is safer to abide by the rule than to not, right? Think of speeding. Everybody speeds. How many kids use that as an excuse for it? Well, you know, you speed and that's illegal. Yes, it is. Every time I speed, I may not get stopped, I may not get arrested, I may not get a ticket, but I increase the likelihood that I will get into an accident, hurt myself, hurt others, do some sort of damage, right? That's a non-negotiable. That is a statement of fact. So our rules are based on safety. There's very few of them, but they are hard and fast and they are not negotiable. And they don't change over time because it isn't any safer for a 12th grader to drink than it is for a 7th grader to drink. So once those rules are established, you need to have the corresponding consequence, right? Just because we have the rule doesn't mean the kids aren't going to break it. We have to assume that they are. And the consequence has to fit the crime, has to be related to the crime, and it has to be able to be enforced easily, effectively, and consistently, right? So you don't want to, I remember when I was back in the Stone Age, when I was making out with my my high school boyfriend in front of our house, and the car windows got steamed up. And when I got inside, my mother grounded me for 88 years. So technically I am still grounded right now, right? Because what would the neighbors think if she saw the car with the, you know, all of that. So anyway, that was an unreasonable consequence for the behavior, and it was not able to be enforced. Obviously, I'm sitting here now. I'm not still grounded. So we want to make sure that our consequences are clear, they're consistent, and we can enforce them and stick to them, okay? I want you to think about the image of a slot machine. You can imagine people in a casino sitting there for hours putting quarters into a slot machine. Why would they do that, right? It seems incredibly tedious and boring. They do that because every now and then the machine will spit back some quarters. Bells will start to ring and 3 cherries will come across the screen and lights will go off, and out from the bottom of the machine comes a bunch of money, right? That is called intermittent reinforcement. Kids and parents are the same. You are the slot machine. The kid is, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Quarter, quarter, quarter. Can I do this? Mom, how about this? Can I go? Can I do, mom, can I? No, 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 no. Ugh, fine, but just this once. And when you say that, that is all those quarters coming out of that slot machine. And so that kid knows that if I try hard enough, I can wear you down and I will get my reward. So some things can be negotiated. Lots and lots of things can be negotiated, right? And that's part of learning how to be flexible, how to make decisions, all of that's very important. But with rules and with substance use, It is not negotiable. You cannot be a slot machine. It is a hard no and a fast no. And if they break the rule, which they will, all of your lovely children will break the rules, as mine did, the consequence has to be swift, consistent, and not negotiable. All right, let me see if I wanted to touch on anything else. One final thing, do not be swayed by good grades. Good grades and mental health issues and substance abuse do not go hand in hand, okay? I know many kids who are struggling with mental health issues, struggling with substance use, that have 4.5 GPAs, that are taking 5 AP courses. So I hear parents say all the time, well, they're doing well in school. It can't be that bad. It can be that bad, okay? The pressure to get good grades is so intense that they will go to great lengths to do that at great cost to their mental health. And they will often resort to ways of relaxing and shutting off their brain that include substances. Turn it over to you now.
Yes. Hi. Well, I wanted to thank the Darien Thriving Youth Task Force for inviting me to be here on this illustrious panel. I'm from Sasko River Center. So I was asked to speak on 3 different points by Emily, who organized this. Thank you. One is what stood out the most to me in the mental health piece of the presentation. And really, it's the open lines of communication. I think that span the entire presentation. I think that's so hugely tied to feeling valued, which is one of the most important, I think, protective factors for teen mental health. Because if you think about it as a teenager, if you have an open line of communication with your parent, that says to you as a teen, my parent is making time for me. My parent wants to hear from me. My parent is curious about me and my life. And my parent wants to engage in a conversation. And if they want to engage in a conversation, that would then mean that maybe they're going to entertain an idea of mine that's different from theirs, or I might have a different interest. And that creates a feeling of value in your teen, that you are interested and you're curious and you are going to accept and be curious about opinions that they might have that are different than yours. Really encouraging this communication creates this feeling of value, which then strengthens a teen's sense of self and security as they negotiate this stage of separation and individuation. As referred to, they're going to look so much to their peers. You're going to be seen as a source of childhood. They're going to give you the side eye and the what, and not really want to communicate in certain ways. And that's tough. That's I'll talk about that in a little while, but you want them to feel this security in themselves and be able to feel free to explore themselves with you so that they can separate and individuate and then negotiate the world that we all want them to step out into. Along the lines of communication, I was also asked to just comment on how you can make your teen feel valued outside of their achievements. And achievements, I think we live in a very achievement-oriented town, county, nation, world right now, well, for a long time, but especially now it feels like, especially as we've seen some of the stressors on our kids, being grades, getting into college, what our community perceives as achievement. In my opinion and in my experience, you can make your teen feel valued by almost noticing the process and not the end result. Notice that they're working hard. Notice and validate feelings around the working hard. Celebrate with them if they're feeling satisfaction around the outcome. If they're feeling discouragement, validate that. Celebrate that. Celebrate the hard work. Celebrate the failures. Maybe not so much the grade or the win, but what's going on either side, the process, the feelings, and the outcome, because even sometimes failures are achievements. I mean, resiliency, getting through it, and being side by side with them in the struggle, trying not to be judgmental about it, but validating that this is hard and this is how we're going to get through it. This is how I can support you through it. I think also validating your child and showing an interest in what they're doing. I hate TikTok. My daughter's on it. I'm going to ask her, why did you choose this song instead of that song? What made you choose that eyeliner instead of this one? I mean, not exactly, but conversations like that. I say to parents sometimes, their kids say, oh, my kid's on Minecraft all the time. Well, do you know anything about Minecraft? No, I hate it. I'm like, well, you're allowing it in your house. You're allowing your child to play on it. Maybe you should sit with them for 2 minutes, just maybe even a minute, and just ask some questions. Ask them what it's like to play it. Just show some interest, even if your child's interests have nothing to do with yours. This is what they are choosing to pursue and developing who they're becoming separate of you. And similarly, you know, if your child, if you grew up playing football and your child decides to go into fencing, you don't know anything about fencing, it's really not what you want for your child. It's not a conversation you can have with the nachos. Well, get involved in fencing because that's what your child is interested in. So showing an interest and curiosity communicates to your child that you value what they're doing and that you're valuing the choices that might be separate from theirs as they kind of grow separate from you. And finally, so it's important that we communicate with our kids, teens, around mental health. Check in with them. How are you doing? And that's just how to communicate with your teen around mental health really depends on your relationship with your teen. I think some parents can sit down on the couch and be like, so how are you doing? I was just at this great presentation at Middlesex about anxiety and depression, all these stress factors. Like, what's life like for you? Like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? And then some parents can't even get their teen to pass them a water without like a grunt or something. So but in the middle section of, between these two extremes, I would say that a lot of teens, in my experience and in my opinion, will engage in a conversation that they're not choosing to start, probably at a time of not their choosing either. And it's a heavy conversation. And sometimes these conversations go better when you're not eye to eye. Maybe you're in the car, maybe you're doing something together like walking, or you're sharing a conversation, or mental health comes up in the context of something else. And you can kind of float it out there like, I wonder what your experiences or your thoughts are on mental health. Like, do you ever feel depressed? Do you ever feel anxious? Kind of float those wonderings and let it settle and listen. Don't trivialize their experience. Don't ask too many questions. And don't see this as the only opportunity you have to talk to your child about mental health. Maybe you're just opening the door. Maybe you're showing your child that it's okay to talk about this and I'm interested in you and I value how you're feeling. And if your teen is not in the place to talk about it, you get a couple signals from them, just leave it there. You can always come back to it, because even just starting this conversation signals to your teen that it's okay to start talking about this. It normalizes and doesn't stigmatize, which I think is really important. So those are my 3 points that I just wanted to chat about without, before we start talking. So.
Sure. And thank you. I'll be brief. I started working on this about a year ago with the group here, and I found out that I'd be working on it because Dr. Adley called me and said, I need you to come to this meeting to help this group put together a survey, which I didn't know included serving over 2,000 students during a pandemic across 2 buildings. But I do have to thank our building administrators, Ellen Dunn and at the time Shelley Summers, for really helping us orchestrate that. We had students completing the surveys over hybrid. We had students completing the surveys in different classes. And I think, as you can see, this year was the greatest number of responses that we've had. So clearly their efforts came to fruition. So, whenever we do something like this, we put all this work into it, we always hope we'll actually get something out of it. And when I looked around today and saw leadership from the Board of Education and leadership from town and leadership from our state representatives, our cabinet leadership, our building administrators here, and most importantly, I think from the presentation here we saw today, our parents, I'm really encouraged that all of this work that was put forth by our students, our administrators, and the Community Fund and Thriving Youth Task Force will really be put to good work to make change for students. So, in my role as the school climate coordinator, one of the things I do is oversee the school climate committees at the building level. And what our commitment is to take this information back to those school climate committees and really think about what were the protective factors that were described in this presentation today? How can we improve our practices to increase students' access to those protective factors? What are the components that are happening in the community and the components that are happening at home that we can support in translating these messages? You know, a common theme you hear is that the people in the room aren't the people that necessarily need to hear the message. So how do we get this message out to our parents where these myths exist? So I hope that I can continue to be a partner with Thriving Youth Task Force and Community Fund toward that common goal we have.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat that we're hoping that you can field. The first one is for Tracy. So how can I start the conversation with a middle schooler about not using alcohol, not using drugs in a way that's developmentally appropriate?
That's a great question. I actually think that the schools, you could correct me, but I actually think the schools are starting this conversation for the parents, right? It's part of their health curriculum. It's there's an awareness about it, which is age appropriate. And so you won't be the first person talking to them about alcohol or vaping or marijuana, right? So they've heard these words, they understand it. And what I would do is be curious. To me, that's the best way to start a conversation with a kid. They're going to turn you off if you start lecturing, right? Even if what you have to say is absolute gold, they're going to turn you off, right? So I try and start with a question and kind of play a little dumb. What do you know about alcohol? Have you ever heard that word, right? What's this vaping thing? Marijuana. Do you guys ever hear about marijuana in school, right? Just these simple questions. And as Rebecca said, just leave it there and see what comes up. But what you're doing is you're just saying, I'm not afraid to utter these words. These words are not taboo, right? We can talk about these things. It doesn't have to be scary. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm actually just curious about what you think, right? That can be a separate conversation, I think, from these are the rules of the house, right? That conversation is you a little bit telling them. It's short, it's sweet, and has to be reiterated throughout time. But starting the conversation about substances in general is, let me just ask some questions. Be curious and be light about it. Don't be heavy, right? And another thing is to say, if something worries you about something your kid is doing or something that their group of friends is doing, it's okay to express that worry, right? Not that you're going to, not that you're in a puddle crying and I'm so worried and oh my gosh, and I have to drink myself because I'm so worried about you drinking. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. But expressing our own emotions about things helps kids learn how to speak an emotional language themselves, okay? So not being afraid to say, that worries me, or that scares me a little bit, or oof, I get a little anxious when I hear about that. That's okay, because it's the way we manage our emotions that's important, not that we have emotions. Right?
Thank you. Then this is a question for Rebecca. Earlier, Tracy had talked about setting the frame, right? And how important that is and that you do it repeatedly. We have a question from a parent about how can I set these expectations and the rules of the house and show this approval without cutting off that line of communication? That is my concern. How can I be that strict parent without being the mean parent?
Yeah, that's tricky, especially with adolescents that kind of want to start moving away from you and developing their own rules. But what I would say to that is involve them in the conversation first, and that helps to create the open lines of communication. You can, as you're creating your framework, this develops with the time of having your family, as your kids grow and you're celebrating their achievements and their developments, your rules and your structure kind of changes and shifts. Once we hit middle school and high school, you have to, you adjust, and it's hard because I was thinking about this the other day. Like when you have toddlers, you celebrate these developmental milestones, like they're walking and they're talking and they're getting their backpacks ready on their own. And then the separation and testing is a developmental achievement. We're not happy about that as parents. Like it is hard to parent adolescents, which is why, so getting back to the question, which is a great question and it's tricky. I think the best way to develop the framework is to, as parents, whether you're a single parent, you have a partner of some kind, you're a united front in collaborating with your kids along the way around this is what, this is what's important to us. This is what's going to keep our family safe. As the adults, we recognize this is good for you. What do you think about that? And kind of move that along through the transition. It's hard if you're tuning into this and you have a 10th grader and you want to develop that framework. That's just going to take a little more time. You're going to have to talk to me at some point, maybe. But it's hard. It's hard to jump in and all of a sudden want to like pull your teen in when you don't already have the structure in place. It's certainly doable, but that would be my advice, is to kind of be a collaborative family in that way with your teen, your adolescent, your tween, understanding who's in charge, who ultimately does make the rules, but your voice counts. Yeah.
Can I just add a little thing to that? What is your kid saying to you when they say you're being mean?
Strict. Safe. You're keeping them safe.
Well, yeah. And I'm angry.
Yeah.
I'm angry. I don't like this. That's okay. It's okay to be angry. We can manage that. So I'm okay being mean, and I'm okay with you being angry. We're okay. We can do this, right? You can be angry and I can be mean. And we still love each other and we still communicate, and we're going to have dinner. Right.
And that's great in developing distress tolerance for our kids.
Right.
So many times parents are like, oh no, okay, fine. So I just won't do it that way. Because they can't tolerate their child being upset. It's okay,
right,
to have feelings. And that's, I think, really important to development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to add too, we trained our staff with the Ross Green development model of collaborative problem solving. And in those same scenarios, it starts with the idea of thinking about, well, where are we agreeing?
Mhm.
And what we're both agreeing on is we're both angry.
Mhm.
So you're angry, you're not allowed to go out tonight. And I'm angry, you're asking me. We both don't want to be angry. So let's solve the problem together. And it's kind of going back to kind of engaging the student in the process, but beginning with where do we get along in the process.
I like that.
So it seems like not being perceived as mean is not necessarily the end goal, right?
Right.
That keeping your child safe is really our primary goal here, as well as keeping that open line of communication. This is a question for Scott from one of the parents. If I'm worried about my child, who can I call in the school so that I can get support? How do you build your child's team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess it depends on the level. At the secondary level, I would always say the school counselor, or the old guidance counselor version, is sort of the point person to go to, because every student has a school counselor, and it's a point person to every person on the team. So they're connected to the school psychologists, to the social workers, to the special education teachers, and to the administrators. And they're also connected closely to the team of teachers your child would have. So it's always a good starting point. What have you been hearing? Usually our school counselors follow the student from year to year. At the elementary level, it might look a little different because there aren't school counselors at those levels, and you might want to reach out to the school psychologist, who is aligned grade based, so that they're going to have that most close connection to the teachers.
And Rebecca, we have a question from the parents. What are your best suggestions for easing anxiety and stress over academic performance? I would venture to say that school is much harder this year than it was during COVID. At least that's how my child perceives it.
Yeah, I've heard that. Kids are experiencing that. Teachers were easier during COVID, and now things are kicking back up. I would say there are certainly mindfulness techniques you can use to encourage your teen or child to help regulate themselves on their own. Some great websites I could share at some point, but I think if this parent is attuned to their child feeling overwhelmed, just being and validating that and saying it's okay to feel overwhelmed. Like, I really feel like I can't say validate your child's feeling enough. And that is going to supersede any mechanism that you can give them to fidget or cope with around just knowing that it's okay to struggle, and knowing it's okay to be overwhelmed, and knowing that you have that open line of communication to tell your parent this is going to bring down their anxiety a whole lot on its own. And then that child, if they're coming home up here and they can say to their parent or their caregiver, I had the worst day, I'm so overwhelmed. And they don't hear, well, what homework do you have to do? Well, why is that? What did you get in that science test? Instead, if they say, you had a really hard day, school is hard right now. Do you want to talk to me about it? And then maybe you go to something, the caregiver knows what might make that child just leave the door open to talk. They're going to come down to here and be able to focus much better on all this work and the tasks that they have to do for the next day or for whatever they're doing. So that generally would be my recommendation. Tracy or Sky, you guys want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that the number one thing we talk to our kids about is school. And the number one thing kids don't want to talk about is school. So similar to what you were saying is find something they're interested in. But if they're coming home saying they're anxious about school, that is not the time to be asking them what they have to do for homework. Yeah. That is the time to distract, put a shiny object over here, go get a Starbucks, go make a cup of tea, go walk the dog, talk about anything but school. And then when they do get emotionally regulated, when they do come down, you could say, do you need anything from me? Can I be helpful in any way? Right? So we tend to jump in as problem solvers. We put on our Superman cape and we want to solve all the problems. And often the kids don't want that from us. And that's part of their individuation and separation. I want to solve this on my own. I don't want your help, but I do want you to listen. Right. So,
and I hear from kids all the time, and the parent picks them up or they come in. It as a parent, you're probably feeling like, well, I want to show that I'm interested. So I'm going to ask how their day was or how school is. They don't want to talk about it for hours. So don't ask, just don't say anything. I talked to this one young woman today who was saying, I don't want my parent to speak to me unless I speak to them. I'm like, I think you need to meet them a little bit halfway on that. But that's how they're feeling. They're just feeling like it's going to come at me with demands, and I just need to relax.
I always find one absolutely ridiculous thing that I read in the news, not the real news, like E-Entertainment News or something like that. The Kardashians are great and like, oh my God. Did you hear about Kanye is now yay? That's what you want to open the conversation with.
I would add to that, maybe the first thing to say to your child as they get into your car or walk through the door is, I'm happy to see you. That's it.
Yep.
Right? No questions, allow them to decompress, but I am so happy to see you. I missed you.
But be okay if they're not happy to see you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They just might not be. So that's okay.
or if you get a grunt.
If you get a grunt, just ignore it. Just move it along. Yeah.
So this is a question for Tracy. To what degree does exposure to drinking around teens influence their decision to drink? So things like family members, older siblings, media, peers, how much is that influencing their decision to drink?
It's huge, right? So it normalizes it. If everybody is doing it in your world, you extrapolate that to everybody's doing it in the world. So it normalizes it, right? So now that doesn't mean you have to keep a sober home unless that's your choice. But it does mean that you drink responsibly, that you that if you have college kids coming home and they're not legal age, yes, maybe they drink at college. They don't drink at home because you're not legal, right? So maintaining that, certainly if there's a history of substance use disorders in your family, it is a genetic disorder. And so knowledge is power, and you know, at the appropriate time and the appropriate age, talking to your kids about the family history and how that is genetic, just like heart disease, just like any other chronic illnesses that we inherit, that we have a more likelihood of catching. They should know that. That's information that they should factor in. And, you know, I love the idea, if you do have somebody in your family that is in recovery, that they introduce younger kids into the world of recovery. A family member in my family did that for my kids, and it changed their world, really. They were so much more aware and so much more able to make decisions after hearing the stories in the room. So if it is something that is part of your family, and it's a part of a lot of our families, again, information is power, not hiding it, not being ashamed of it, being open about it, and kind of being joyful about it, right? But more importantly, to answer the question, yes, yes, yes. The more exposure kids have, the more it becomes normalized, and the more likely they are to start.
And one last question for the three of you. What is an appropriate consequence for a child who's caught drinking? Should we ground them for 88 years?
Absolutely.
Should we not allow them to play sports anymore? What should we be doing? What is an appropriate consequence, a punishment that fits the crime?
Right. So it's a consequence. It's a rule based on socializing. How do you socialize, right? So what you do is you restrict socializing for a period of time, and that's family dependent. I'm not going to sit here. I don't think any of us would sit here and tell you, you know, just like how much screen time is too much. That it's very family dependent. It's based on your values. But taking away things that provide joy to your kid is not appropriate, right? And also, if you've given them a reward for something else, like say they're going to, that they got rewarded for, I don't know, some achievement, and they get to go to a concert, and then they drink, and the concert's in a month. You don't take the concert away, because that reward is based on other behavior, right? They can be grounded for a period of time up until the concert, but don't take a reward away that's already been given based on something else. So for me, it's about how they spend their social time.
I would say too, that it's really important for kids of any age to understand what the consequences are.
Yes.
So as Tracy was saying earlier, you know, when you develop the rules, non-negotiable, no drinking, if you do this will happen.
Right.
And therefore, because sometimes I think parents, you know, or you might not have done that, fine. If you hear that your child was caught, you know, and you have a different consequence for marijuana, and you're in the moment, don't tell them they're grounded for 88 years. You can say, I need to think about this anytime for any consequence. I just need to think about this. We're going to get back to you on the consequence. So I just wanted to add
that. It's a sensitive topic, because it's a conversation we've been having a lot as a high school administration and middle school administration over the past few months, really. I think it's really, consequences for things like this are very complicated, and they're very specific to the student, as with all consequences. So to go off your speeding example, a $60 speeding ticket for somebody who's a billionaire is likely not a consequence.
Right.
But a $60 speeding ticket to a student who's working their first job might be a consequence. It's very important to consider the why. And I think we do that thoughtfully when we have to engage in thinking about discipline, is what is the why? A student who says, I had to smoke this morning because I was so anxious. I was having a panic attack walking into school is a different situation than I'm in the bathroom with 4 friends and we're having fun skipping class. Same behavior overall, different consequences likely. And it's very important to know your child to understand why. And sometimes when the consequence is too tough, you actually shut off conversations about the why. So it's really important, I think, to understand who your child is, why the behavior occurred, and to be making sure that the consequence is commensurate with the reason why it happened. So it's sort of that. It's similar to thinking about rewards, right? If the reward for one student is something they're interested in, and then you try to apply that to another student, and they're not interested in that same thing, it doesn't work. And so it's the same with consequences. They align with the same behavioral principles.
Thank you. So this concludes our evening. And we want to say thank you to all of our panelists and everyone who has joined us here in person. Thank you for making all your way out here, as well as everyone who is joining us at home. Just know that you don't have to figure this out on your own. You have a lot of people around you. And we know that, again, this is the start of the conversation. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. So thank you again and good night.